Welcome to High Noon, where we talk about controversial subjects with interesting people. And I'm so pleased to have Tom Rogan on this week. We're going to be discussing Tucker Carlson's Putin interview, a subject where that I have seen shockingly little serious commentary on, because so much of the commentary seems to be about whether Tucker should or should not have done this interview, and we'll get into that question as well. But I also wanted to ask Tom about the substance of what Putin said during this interview. Tom is it's over at the Washington Examiner. He's an online editor and foreign policy writer there. He writes frequently on these kinds of issues, including about Russia, China, and the Middle East, and holds a Bachelor of Arts in War Studies. I wish American universities still had a subject called War Studies, but
they do it in the service academies, and maybe at the Citadel, but not civilian colleges.
Yeah. So this is from King's College London, and he has a Master of Science in Middle Eastern politics and many degrees from many places. You've read his work in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Reuters, the Independent, the Atlantic, National Review, Telegraph, the Guardian. But his permanent home, as I said, is at the Washington Examiner. So he knows a lot about these issues, and he's been writing about them and thinking about them for a long time. So welcome, Tom, to High Noon.
Thanks, Inez. I appreciate the kind introduction.
So like I said in your introduction, it's odd to me that there has been very little, so far as I can tell, very little substantive analysis of what Putin said in this interview. But like everyone else, we'll begin with the question of whether or not Tucker Carlson did a good piece of journalism, or whether it was somehow illegitimate for him to go and interview Vladimir Putin. Before the interview came out, I got a lot of pushback on Twitter for tweeting that either he had done an excellent piece of journalism, a brave piece of journalism that would be important for the world to watch, or he was about to humiliate himself like Jane Fonda, playing Escalatio with the North Vietnamese and posing on cannons that were aimed at American soldiers, right? So which was it? What is your sense of how Tucker conducted himself in this interview?
Yeah, so I think the interview generally went very well. On the caveat, though, that people judge what Putin says against the historical record and think about it, that they don't take it literally. And some people, and I mentioned this, I referenced one person in my piece on Twitter who had a random Twitter account but seemed to have a big following, was taking Putin literally at his words. That's a problem if you do that. But in terms of the questions and the general form of the interview, I thought it was beneficial. And as one example, people were giving Tucker Carlson quite a lot of criticism for the early stage of the interview, where Putin especially went on this long historical or ahistorical rant that he didn't interrupt Putin. Well, Democrats, Republicans, every American president and senior official has experienced some variation of that, where Putin goes on 45 minutes, sometimes a long list of grievances. And if you want to get into a discussion, you kind of have to just let him rant. And so to blame Tucker Carlson for that, I think, is unfair in the sense that it doesn't blame every former president who's met Putin for experiencing the same thing.
I mean, Tucker does generally have this kind of hands-off interview approach, which to my mind does not make him, even though I like a lot of his programming and stuff, does not make him a top interviewer in my view, because he does really just let people talk. And he did a bit of that here, but I didn't find it when he actually asked questions. And as you say, there was this 45-minute period in the beginning where Putin was basically not entertaining questions. But he did press him repeatedly during that period on why is this relevant? Let's go to 2022 when you invaded the sovereign borders of the country next to you. Please tell us the relevance of this very long story beginning in 800 AD. And he did push back quite aggressively, I thought, actually, on that point. But yes, I mean, my assessment is very similar to what you wrote and what you just said, which is that aside from the fact that, yeah, like this is his general style to allow people to talk, and it's very difficult not to allow Putin to talk when you are sitting with the dictator of the country in the country that he controls. I thought that the questions that Tucker asked, generally speaking, were relevant. They were not obsequious questions, in my view. There were several key points, and maybe we'll get to some of them, where Putin was very clearly unhappy about
Mm,
the questions that were being asked. Um, he did at the end ask about the Wall Street Journal reporter who's being
right.
jailed in Russia, which was a brave thing to do, honestly, in the situation that he was in. I mean, we'll get to Putin in a minute, but I actually thought I thought, I would give Tucker like a B or a B plus on this. I thought this was a let's say an elusive, illuminating interview with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the one area where perhaps he could have been stronger is pushing Putin on the discrepancy between his argument to Tucker Carlson in the interview that Russia has no interests beyond Ukraine, doesn't want to threaten NATO, and some pretty recent speeches, quite frankly, including a long historical record of Putin talking about natural Russian claims actually in that same interview to Poland, for example, but certainly threats to Estonia, referencing Peter the Great, which he had done in a speech last year. And then secondly, the Russian, what they would call their special services, but their intelligence services, some of the malevolent activities that they get up to that specifically affect Americans in a way that I think dilutes Putin's narrative that openly or his overt narrative that he seeks a compromise with the United States in which we can all get along. This is someone who is ultimately an ardent adversary, but still I think Putin's sense of the United States is so lamentable, or his view is so negative towards the United States, that did trickle through the interview. And I think people watching Putin again, with a sense for the historical record, which is obviously a lot harder. Like a lot of Americans, I mean, myself, very few people are going to have a immediate baseline of knowledge for, Central and Eastern European or Central European, medieval history, and so, or early modern history. So, there's a challenge to holding Putin to account, but digging a little bit in, especially on some of the Second World War stuff, which is just totally fantastical, is possible.
Yeah, I was hoping that if any Americans were still awake by the middle of his rant, that the way that he described World War II as beginning, maybe being the reference point of history that a lot of Americans would know, would give them a clue as to how seriously to take his overall, or at least not seriously is the wrong word. How much accuracy to assign to his vision of history, which, by the way, I think he does believe. If there's anything that he's sort of demonstrated over time, is he's consistent on having this historical view of the world that doesn't align in key ways with the actual history of the region. So let's start with the first 45 minutes of this 2 hour 20-minute or so interview, where he begins before the first millennium, describing essentially the intertwining of I don't even want to call it Russian and Ukrainian. It's more just like Moscow and Kiev, and the civilizations around those. And he tells this story all the way up through World War II. What do you think what do you think Americans should, first of all, what are the key points there where Putin is writing a very convenient history for his country? And two, what are the important pieces of Putin's understanding of Russian history himself for Americans to understand?
Well, I think the crunch point when Putin says, and this is obviously jumping, further towards the end of that first element, but when Putin says that it was the Poles who invited the Second World War by pushing Hitler too far, I thought that was a very striking and important thing for people to pay attention to, because it is utterly incompatible with reality. I mean, the Nazis were putting a massive amount of pressure on the Poles to open up the Danzig corridor, to essentially cede them space. And the Russians cut a deal with them. The Soviet Union cut a deal. And people can Google this, right? It's not the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, is not something that is historically controversial for most people. And as a secondary point there, when Putin is essentially blaming the Poles for starting World War II and giving Hitler a pass. How is that a historical narrative in any way sympathetic towards Putin's idea now that he is fighting in Ukraine to stop neo-Nazis? The contradiction in terms is laughable almost. But going back to that earlier historical record, I think the top line is the idea of this symbiosis of Russian cultural history and territorial activity and imperial activity, as it were. And so he talks a lot about Rus and the early stages of Russia and various princes and principalities, and essentially is fusing different threads of localized empires or kingdoms to try and paint the picture of an evolving greater Russia that is a sort of almost manifest destiny of Russia that he is now the guardian for. The problem is when you dive into the actual details, this is, he's drawing strands between disparate threads and overlooking elements where the idea of, a greater Russia is not the case. And again, it's there's a lot of history that he's talking about there, but a lot of it, when one looks into the details, is just not accurate. And it's also quite, I think, interesting when you consider that he mentions the story in the 1980s when he would have been a KGB officer traveling around Ukraine and finding out that everyone he ran into identified as Russian or Hungarian. Well, if that's the case in relatively recent history, why are so many Ukrainians, to the shock of the Russians who thought they would simply lay down their arms and yield, why are so many Ukrainians essentially so resolute in trying to stand up for the idea of an independent Ukrainian statehood, and also going to that cultural level, which is so important for, I think, Putin's, certainly his domestic mythos. Why is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, for example, separating itself from the Russian Orthodox Church, which supposedly has had this natural spiritual, reach that would go beyond state nationality? And so the devil in the detail of what Putin says is applied to reality becomes, I think, highly problematic for his narrative. And again, as a top line point for Americans there, it is this weaving of fiction and history. I think, people should look, well, why would someone do that? And the reason is to paint a narrative that is favorable to Russians' interest, to Putin's interests, which is again ultimately the formulation or the formation of a new Russian imperium, and certainly in with its proximate neighbors. And so that is the top line from all the historical names and date dropping that he did.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're right to draw this tension between the alleged sort of reasoning behind invading Ukraine to quote unquote denazify it, when it's really clear in the first 45 minutes of this interview that the claim, and I'm not saying that Hitler and Putin are running the same kind of political system, or they're doing the same sorts of things domestically or even internationally. The claim is actually kind of similar, right? Which is anywhere where there are Russian speakers, anywhere where there's a pocket of Russian ethnicity, or where the Russian Empire at any stage of its development, right, has ever had control over, I basically extend the, if not the borders literally of the Russian Federation, at least the sort of sphere of influence to all of those places. And actually really my favorite moment of pushback from Tucker came exactly on that matter of Ukraine being having a large Hungarian population and having lands within its modern borders that were once attached to Hungary. Where Tucker implies, well, if you take over Ukraine by this same standard, this same historical standard that you're applying, I mean, does Orban have a claim against you, essentially, for these old lands? And you could tell immediately that Putin did not like that question, because the way that he wants to tell history is only Russia gets to extend into everybody else's borders to claim any territory where their people might reside, or where they might have controlled, 400 years ago or 800 years ago or 1,000 years ago, when the reality, the obvious reality of, especially of the post-war world, is, yeah, like every country, particularly in that region, but even well beyond it, is those national borders contain pieces of what used to be culturally or nationally the countries around it, right? Poland has pieces that used to be Germany. Ukraine has pieces that used to be Hungary, right? Russia itself has many lands that used to be like ethnically this or that. And the reason that the West has wanted to, as much as possible, freeze the borders is because those kinds of claims cause wars, right? And they cause instability. The recognition of those essentially ethnic claims makes the borders fragile and unstable. No.
Well, exactly, and also the fact that I think there is the nation states that exist in these areas essentially have a functioning democratic structure in which the voices of their citizens are reflected, even if there may be grievances. The situation, for example, in northern Estonia, the Baltic states, in terms of their Russian-speaking populations, is significantly more stable, even though the Russian government attempts to, exploit frictions and expand them. It's significantly more stable than what you see in terms of some of the ethnic and religious tensions in the Balkans. And so this idea for Putin that this is all Russia and it belongs with Russia, I think leads to the central question for Americans, which is, and you do see this in elements of the right, that we should seek a detente with Russia and we've been unfair on Russia, and Putin sort of has a point here. You can only make that argument if you accept a false moral principle or a false reality that Putin purveys, that all of these people want to be Russians and it's his backyard, etc. But you also have to sacrifice or yield that the United States essentially adopted the wrong strategy in the Cold War, certainly the latter part of the Cold War, where it became more territorial and, frankly, in a sense, less ideological as a global project from the Soviet Union. That it is in America's interest to allow countries like Estonia, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia to be absorbed, Ukraine obviously, to be absorbed by Russia, and that those, the free will of those peoples should not matter to the United States, and that essentially it's worth it to give Putin that. And as a secondary point here, what I always find quite striking in terms of, I think, the weakness of that argument is not simply that I would say moral betrayal and betrayal of people who have been very good allies, who do spend more than 2% significantly, who would fight on day one. Frankly, some of those nations who would fight with us against China in the Pacific because they value their relationship with America so much. These countries are not Germany, for example, which is not a very good ally, in my view. The secondary point is that if you are suggesting, as some do, that we should seek some grand compromise with Russia and seek those things, what do you expect you're going to get back from Russia? Because there's not a lot that the Russians, frankly, because of their economic weakness, would be able to provide to the United States beyond perhaps a cooling of, brinkmanship and tensions. And maybe that's worth it, but then you need to accept that you are essentially yielding to Putin's fear game, right? That this idea of strength and America first is not so America first if essentially the only benefit you're getting in return for giving them all this territory and sacrificing all these peoples is maybe they're a little bit less likely to, dangle nuclear threats. And we have our own potent nuclear forces which do deter the Russians. My view is you stick with the old game, which is respect the Russians, listen to them, deal with them where possible, but don't dance to their less beautiful swan dance.
Yeah, it's.
Sorry, I know that was a bit of a rant.
No. I was thinking about, like, the fact that I really think like Putin miscalculated not his assessment of the West, and he's known as for the most part as a kind of hard-headed realpolitik, plays the hand his country has internationally fairly well. I mean, that's his reputation, right? And I think it's a large part of his popularity with his own people. But um, there is this big blind spot in the history that he's telling, especially the more modern history, that he pretends essentially that the wills of those peoples that you're referencing have not independently been stirred by Russian behavior in the past, right? So he pretends that Ukrainian national identity doesn't exist, which is historically insane. Not least because of some of the things he points to badly, right? By saying that, bringing up like the Volhynia region, bringing up the massacres that took place there during World War II against, and he's right about this part, about not just against Jews and Poles, but also Russians, right? But in doing that, he is already giving away the game this is a national identity. This is not something that was invented by the CIA, whatever machinations they may have had, whatever bumblings they have in Ukraine. The feeling of Ukrainians that they don't want to live under the Russian system is in no small part caused by Putin himself and the actions of Russia.
Well, exactly, and also, it requires the notion, frankly, that the CIA created the Holodomor, right? In the 1920s and 1930s, the Soviet mistreatment of Ukrainians, the CIA didn't even exist then. That is a key birthing point for the idea of a separate Ukrainian identity, or not a birthing point, but certainly a great fueling catalyst, because of Stalin's treatment. There is a reason that, the Ukrainians, some of them were sympathetic to the Germans. Now, I think in the balance of historical record, that obviously was a significant moral mistake, in the same way that, there were sympathizers in other countries, but there was a sizable pro-Nazi sentiment in Ukraine during the Second World War, which obviously provides ammunition to Putin. But to suggest that that is the same case today would be tantamount to suggesting, that we need to fear Germany because that was the birthplace of, the Third Reich. And frankly, the Germans are not exactly very militarist anymore in any sense of the word. Frankly, I would say they're too, absent in there. They need a bit more militarism. Of course, not the style of before. But regardless, this idea, Putin, his creation of fake history with some historical reality, in there, to lend credibility, which is the old KGB trick. You don't tell an entire lie, you bleed your lie with, sprinklings of historical truth. But then Putin's key strength, I think, is his ability to come across and this sort of, the self-presentation as someone who is frustrated, serious, but credible. He's a good actor in a way. And I don't think he believes, more than half of what he says, but I think he does believe half of it. And the rest is, very compelling, theater, which is, theater is very important to, Russian political presentation, much the same way, well, in a different way than it is in the United States. But there's a lot of theater going on here that people need to recognize. And again, I always come back, the overriding narrative with the Russians, whether it's negotiating a treaty, an exchange, whatever, is, holding what is said by the Russians to what is done over a period of time. And that, that bears relevance, for example, when Putin is suggesting it was the deep state and Robert Gates, etc., who prevented some idea of a positive détente with the United States under the Bush administration. Well, the reality is those framework, which could have been beneficial, which, frankly, you could see areas on, I would say, arms control treaties where it would be beneficial to both sides in the world to agree major deals. The reason those deals tend to fall apart is not because of a deep state going behind American presidents, but because when you get into the devil of the detail in terms of enforcement mechanisms, inspections, access, various protocols, what the Russians say does not match up to what they do. And we have numerous examples of this in more recent history under Putin himself. Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Russians sign that and then systematically break it and scream that it's a lie when everyone in NATO, including Hungary, for example, and Turkey, say that no, they have broken it. Or the Chemical Weapons Convention, and they say no, we've signed up to this, we never work on chemical, biological weapons, and then they, with a level of gall that frankly only Putin's government could pull off, use various high potency nerve agents and engage in some very systemic biological weapons research. And so this is not the reality as measured against what is said is so fundamentally divergent that I think, and that's the point I think that comes out, that's that grounding point, that if you watch the Tucker interview with that context, then it is positive, because you can sort of begin to see through, the deceptions. But of course, it does require the harder effort of, doing some research and looking into some of this stuff, which I think, frankly, Putin's appeal with some Americans is that, understandably in some sense, they haven't, looked into the detail of this. They're just sort of listening at face value, and it seems compelling.
So I think he does believe largely that the version of history he told. I think when it comes to more modern sort of geopolitical machinations, I think you're right. It's very Machiavellian in what he presents, and it's clearly to a purpose. I think the evidence that he really does believe this vision of history, and in particular that Ukrainian national identity is some kind of fiction invented by the West, is by all accounts, he thought this war would be over, quite quickly. He did not anticipate the depth of Ukrainian resistance, and like what you said, the number of people who were willing to die not to be ruled directly by Russia, and to keep their national borders. It really seems to me now, with the benefit of hindsight and looking back since 2022, that this was, that this was a mistake that Putin made, that exactly because of his ideological view of history, he didn't move in with a heavy enough force to smash through what was, I think, anyone in Ukraine would have immediately told you, right? Of course, this is not going to be easy. Of course, this is not going to be a war without mass resistance from the Ukrainian side. But because he has this ideological frame, he was not able to anticipate that kind of resistance because he thinks it's a fiction invented by the CIA.
Right, and I also think it's the point that he believed that the population would be malleable, that you could essentially coerce, terrorize into quick obedience, and that the state structure, the government, the military would essentially yield, that Russian agents provocateurs, agents in place inside those Ukrainian government structures, would facilitate the Russians. But clearly he thought this would be a walkover, and the absolute proof, as it were, for that is the Russian air assault that was launched in Kiev in the beginning of the war. That you do not send paratroopers into the enemy's capital city unless you believe they can be relieved in short order by mechanized or armored forces moving in behind them. Otherwise, they're just going to, as was the case, get annihilated. But he still sent them in, which shows, again, he thought there would be this collapse. I also think one of the challenges is the deep, where the delusion extends, and you still see this, that what Putin is told by, he believes in his own sort of fiction of the Russian military that he has rebuilt, pumped huge amounts of money in, was going to be a highly effective entity. That when the Russian intelligence services were briefing him, we've got all these people in Ukraine who are going to essentially implode the government when we go in. Or he totally ignored the level of corruption and influence of yes men, which still exists, frankly. I mean, Narishkin, who's the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, was the only one, as we understand it, to significantly, put an argument to Putin that this is going to be harder than you think before Ukraine. which is partly why I think you see that memorable exchange, which is worth people going back to if they haven't seen it, of before the war. People can just go into YouTube and type in Putin SVR chief, to find this, where Putin is lecturing Narishkin very harshly in public over whether he supports this, referendum or whatever it was. I can't remember exactly at the time, but essentially supports the sort of war effort. Putin does not like disagreement. He doesn't like to be challenged in, his perceptions. There's an ego here that, is quite personally, I think, a liability for him that we need to be aware of.
Well, let's move to the NATO arguments, because I think, first of all, he doesn't get to 2014, the Maidan Revolution and NATO until more than an hour into this interview, right? So I think I'm just, based on my recollection, could be slightly off a little bit, but there's a large part of the interview before he even gets to anything regarding NATO, right? And I think it's related to what we're talking about, this sort of blind spot, because the story that he tells about NATO is the West. We keep telling the West, you're threatening us with the expansion of NATO. You're threatening us with the expansion of NATO. You're threatening us. And they keep ignoring us and adding more countries to NATO that are closer and closer to our borders. And I think there's a part of, especially the right, but generally, I think, especially without a lot of the background of the history of the region, I think that sounds kind of reasonable to Americans on first glance, right? That you can certainly understand from a pragmatic perspective why Russia would not like the NATO alliance, right on its border. We are historical enemies. It just sounds like a reasonable request to make. So what really is the story of NATO expansion, and what would you like to fill in, let's say, around Putin's narrative on this?
Well, there is, to be perfectly honest, I think there is an element of reasonableness, certainly in the 2004 recession of some of the Baltic states, that implications, not commitments. The Russians always say it was commitments, or Putin says it was commitments given that NATO would not expand. I mean, that is just not true. But implications by Western leaders that expansion was not a key concern, essentially went, what happened is that with this 2004 recession, then George W. Bush, believed, as part of the kind of promote freedom agenda, countries wanting to be associated with the United States, that the US would go forwards with that. And that obviously greatly upset, Putin for the reasons you outlined there. But I think the fundamental point here is that, number one, why did those countries want to join NATO? Didn't come from the ether. That it was because of systemic Russian efforts to, undermine their democratic structures and democracies, because of the historical record of threat, because of, again, the imperial interest that they know Putin has purveyed. And essentially, free countries wanted to join a defense alliance. And the United States, and other NATO members, said yes to that, all the other NATO members. So there was a democratic legitimacy to the choice that Putin cannot, even if he has a grievance, say, as he does, or cannot say legitimately as he does, that this was some outrage offense. Essentially, they were joining a defensive alliance. And the Russian paranoia over NATO is, to some, I think, significant extent, felt, deeply. But Russia does not get a veto on the democratic choices of other nations. And, what is, I mean, the more relevant point here, I think, is, Ukraine's, the narrative that Putin put forward in, before the war, is that Ukraine was imminently going to join NATO. I mean, clearly that was not the case. Even if you think that a future American government or British government or Polish government would have supported that, the French and Germans wouldn't have. I mean, the Turks wouldn't have. There are many different nations with it, and everyone in NATO has to agree to accept a new member, certainly in the context of Russian threats. I think there's an awareness of that 2004 experience, 2007 experience, in terms of NATO calculations. And so, yes, did Putin have a grievance? He did, but it wasn't the kind of absolute justifiable grievance that he pretends it was. And ultimately, free peoples decided to do something through their democratic structures. And it is, to this day, the Russians that attempt to, through their intelligence apparatus, undermine, attack the Baltic states, 2007 major cyber attack in Estonia, versus the other way around. Again, and that's why they joined NATO, right? They were concerned about that, threat from Russia. And if we look at what Putin has done to Ukraine, well, if the Baltics weren't in NATO, would he have done that to them? And would that have been good for, international stability and the basic moral right of peoples to live in freedom? And I think one of the reasons that Putin's argument has more sympathy with Americans now than it did is the idea of the blurring of the lines, which I think he quite skillfully does, of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan to a lesser degree is America. Certainly the war in Iraq is an American effort to spread freedom, in some sense as it was, being such a debacle as it turned out to be. And that when you say to Americans, you question that idea of should America always be standing everywhere for human freedom, you dangle the bell a little bit in American minds of could this lead to another Iraq disaster if we push the line too hard here? And so it's this sort of mixing of different things with a thread that ignores, again, existing democratic structures versus Iraq's situation, choosing to join a defensive alliance. And to me, that essentially reduces a lot of the political potency, at least in terms of how we should approach foreign relations with Russia, to what is otherwise and is to some sense in the Russian mind a legitimate grievance.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few thoughts I want to respond to that with. One, I mean, I think a lot of Americans are so, with good reason, are so cynical about our own system and democratic accountability here, that those lines about democracy and liberal democracy and freedom, they ring quite hollow in our own domestic crisis, right? But there's this lack of understanding of how what those words mean to people from the former Soviet satellite states, for example. They still have, I would say that in a lot of these states, it's still 1983 in America. That's how they think of our system, which is kind of charming to me, actually. It reminds me of a better time in America. But anyway, no, there is this sense, if you want a very good modern example happening right now of the process by which a lot of these states joined NATO, you can look at Finland right now, right? Because Russia is threatening its neighbors, both covertly and by marching armies across their border. And now Finland, which did not have much interest in joining NATO, now Finland, is in and wants to be part of NATO. And now he has NATO directly on his border, right? In a way that would not have happened if he had not invaded Ukraine. There was no interest, as far as I understand, maybe you can correct me, but there was not much interest in Finland joining NATO before this war. But it's the same kind of thing. He's creating, excuse me, he's creating the conditions in which these free peoples, as you say, feel that they become more desperate to join a security alliance like NATO, with the way that Putin's Russia behaves. And then there's this other element that I keep, because of my family background in Poland and stuff, I keep reintroducing to this discussion. So there's the hard-headed security part of this, where when Russia acts aggressively towards its neighbors, those neighbors become, not shockingly, more interested in joining the West or NATO. Or there's also just there really is a border between two systems there. And as much as there are legitimate criticisms of the Western system now in what seems to be disrepair and decay, the fact remains, in sort of a hard-headed, pragmatic sense, domestic sense. You have the example of Ukraine and Poland, pretty close to the same number of people, pretty close to the same GDP when the Soviet Union collapses, right, in the late 80s. One essentially remaining a Russian satellite state until the mid 2010s, and one very clearly joining with the West, joining the EU, joining NATO, et cetera, and living in a more liberal democratic system. That border that started out basically the same is now a 4 times GDP multiplier.
Right.
I mean, Poland is unfathomably richer than the Ukrainians with whom they started out basically on par. And people see that. So they see that with all the criticisms of the West now, that life under the Russian orbit meant a lot of corruption, which was responsible for the protests, not the CIA, protests in Belarus in 2020, the kind of poor economic outlook that the average person has is especially as a satellite state, but even within Russia itself, right? And unlike Russians in Russia, these people have no ethnic tie to the Russian Empire to be proud of or whatever. And so it becomes a quite straightforward proposition. Join the West, become much wealthier, gain key political freedoms, even if not in sort of perfection, and just fundamentally live a better life where your kids actually have opportunities that their grandparents didn't, or stay with the Russian system. There's this very stark demarcation between the two systems, and it's clear to people on the border which system is more successful as of now. And so Putin has that problem, that he won't acknowledge that the reason his satellite states and his border states are spinning off into the orbit of the West is because there's a reason the people there want to. They look across their borders on the other side and they see a life much better than what the Russian Empire is able to offer them.
No, I think that's exactly right. And, again, you draw that really important. Poland, obviously, with some recent political challenges, but has come through them, new government. There's been a lot of tensions in much the same way there have been here over the role of the judiciary in politics and, the power of the executive. But the Poles have got through it. What is the situation in Russia? Well, Putin is banning even marginal presidential candidates that might pose a challenge to his rule. Corruption remains endemic and is a function, or is a just part and parcel of the system. The system relies on corruption, as it did in Ukraine, and to a degree still does in Ukraine, rely on corruption, and the average person's prospects and sense of opportunity, I think, are greatly diminished. But beyond, Poland's GDP, for example, is set to overtake the UK. And that is a tribute to, frankly, the democratic capitalist model. Now you can make criticisms about some of the social welfare in the Western Europe, which I think are very legitimate. But again, that basic point of human aspiration and opportunity is clearly better served by the broad Western model than it is by the kleptocratic Russian model. At the same time, there is this, you mentioned Finland. It's important for people to remember it. Finland hosted the 2018 Helsinki summit between Presidents Trump and Putin, because the Russians felt that Finland would be essentially a somewhat neutral country to go to. And in that short space of time, now Finland has, directly joined NATO. Again, why is that? Well, because the Russians, essentially messing around in Ukraine, but also the Finns recognizing this is part of a broader project, for Putin. It is not, as he told Tucker Carlson, just about Ukraine and this special link. It is about a broader project that he believes, to some degree, or desires certainly, Russian domination of, proximate nations. He would desire that with the Chinese, were he able to. But the discrepancy between this great, and I think actually in the longer term, China is going to pose a real challenge for Putin as much as it is an economic lifeline at the moment. Because
I noticed how friendly his careful, even like in contrast to the sort of masculine image that nationalist image he projects towards the West, he was very ginger talking about China, and I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I like that. I think that was very noticeable, and that's why I would say this is actually a really important point for one of the reasons. I think I should emphasize this more in my piece. One of the reasons that interview was, in my view, certainly more of a gain than a loss is that any intelligence analyst, someone looking at the nuance, that just that alone, how Putin refers to China there, how he plays up the idea of the Chinese currency displacing the United States, and is just show how, for example, when you look at when he hosted Xi Jinping in Moscow last year or the year before, the level of political submissiveness that is quite overt it's striking contrast with the narrative that Putin otherwise puts across of his own rule, because he essentially he's decided he needs the Chinese as this major economic and trading partner counterbalance towards the West. But there is no question, and the Chinese know this as well in terms of how they deal with the Russians, there's no question that Russia is the secondary and junior partner in a very power politics way. There's few efforts. The Russians, I'm sure, would prefer a lot more efforts to hide the imbalance there. But again, this is not a stable, grand, I would say longer term Russian renewal project under Putin, because the systemic weaknesses of his political structure, economy, rule of law, and the countermanding appeal of other systems, are so stark.
What is your sense of what Putin gained by giving this interview? Because to my mind, I'm and it took me a while to sort of come to. I've been thinking about this interview since I watched it, 4 days ago, and I'm coming to a pretty strong conclusion that I think actually he played this one badly. That he had the opportunity, especially with Tucker Carlson's audience, to really lean into some of the NATO claims that we both agree have some reasonableness to them, especially like in a pragmatic way, to really lean into those claims, to really lean into his sometimes conspiratorial, but also these days sounding much more close to the truth about the dominance of the deep state in America and its circumventing presidents. I feel like he would have found a receptive and manipulable audience to his own ends if he had talked more about those things. And he only got to that in like I said, 90 minutes in, where I think almost every average American viewer had already shut it off, after the first 15 minutes about Yaroslav the Wise. It's like very much not aimed at an American audience. And if he wanted to speak to a Russian audience, well, he can do that in 1,000 different ways without needing to speak to an American journalist.
And it also goes back to, I think it's a fantastic point, goes back to the weakness of his analytical structure, especially the intelligence services telling him, because they would have briefed him extensively on, as they did when he mentions Tucker Carlson and the CIA. There are things that he clearly, there would have been a lot of thinking going into having this interview, and the fact that he was not aware that this would not be, I think the top line, you're correct, it was a failure on his part in terms of the intended audience, but he clearly did not realize that sufficiently, or was not given even the analytical brief that what you need is something tight, as you say, focused on NATO, keep it, quick, whatever, 30 minutes. He believed that, the figures of on Twitter X of Tucker Carlson, how many views he gets, that, you could go on this, exponential rant and you're still going to retain viewership in a way that you perhaps, or you far more likely would be able to do in Russia in terms of, the political dialogue there. I think the best moment or the key moment from his point of view would have been where he mentions, with Americans, the border, you have these other things. Why can't we just compromise?
Yeah,
what are
I
we
thought
doing? Like that was
he
his,
clearly
but it
knew
was
that
so
was what to say to the audience, and he left it for hour
right,
two
right.
inexplicably. Like He could have. I
Right.
think he really could have gotten a PR coup out of this, and
Right.
he kind of threw it away.
And he could have done as well. He could have said, "We're willing to talk about, a nuclear arms control," within the minute there, and it would have been, almost certainly total BS. But he could have said it. Then he could have said the border thing, and that's essentially, you've ticked that box, and you've made sure that everyone who's going to watch has seen that. And of course, it plays pitch perfectly in a way to the domestic environment now, with with the House considering the Senate legislation without border action, that a lot of Americans, a lot of people in the Republican Party are saying, why is it that we can do this for the international, for foreign allies, partners, and we can't secure our own border? I mean, there would have been a saliency there for him in terms of the argument, but again, he can't, I think, escape his, he's not the genius that he presents himself to be. Sometimes there's a lack of introspection, which I think is quite inherent to the political structure he's established. Weakness is anathema to the Russian political psyche, and so he's sort of caught him. Yeah, it was a failure, is the top line. Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah, it's it's a comfort in a way, or I'm not sure it should be a comfort, considering these are two nuclear armed nations, but who don't like each other very much. But it is a comfort in a way to watch Putin misunderstand an American audience as much as Americans, I think, deeply misunderstand Russian intentions. I mean, if I could sum up what I think is very difficult for Russians to accept about America, is that the average American's posture towards Russia is very much like the Mad Men meme, right? I don't think about you at all. Whereas as Putin, but also the people that he represents in a very real way, they really think Americans wake up every morning thinking how to humiliate Russia. And this is just, it's impossible to get. I think I think this is a large part. Maybe I'm doing a little too much sort of ethnic pop psychology here, but I think that's why a lot of the resets with Russia have failed. It's not simply a realpolitik. Okay, we might have common interests here. Let's try to work together here, right? There's also this deep sense that the West is humiliated Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There's, again, not a total, I don't think that's totally wrong. I mean, Russia, as opposed to the satellite states, and as opposed to the fall of the wall, was a glorious event for many people in Eastern Europe, right? But for Russians themselves, what they got after the Soviet Union, and the reason for the strength bias that you're talking about in Russian leadership, is they got chaos and corruption and multiple different gangs of guys with guns, demanding protection money from you. They got ruled by competing mafia bands, basically, and so you can understand from that perspective, they were the one of two global preeminent powers with a vast territorial empire. And afterwards, they were sold for parts by their own, sort of mafia oligarchs. And that is humiliating. But from the American perspective, they're like, oh, look at how people are making money in Moscow. There are no communists,
Right.
And so there's this lack of understanding about the national humiliation factor, and this historical factor that Putin started with. There's a reason he started with that and not with NATO. It's because it's more important in many ways to the way that Russia behaves on the global stage than any particularities about NATO expansion, in my view.
Yeah, but I also think deep below the surface, and it is a critical point that we have to remain fixated on, is also, which sparked essentially the invasion of Ukraine, a really hostile ambition, an imperial, territorial, and political ambition to dominate, independent countries, certainly proximate to Russia. And that's why you see as much of the corruption. There's, was huge investment in the Russian military coming up to the invasion of Ukraine. He believed he had built a hyper-modern, efficient military. Of course, a lot of the money had been stolen within the system. But again, it's the humiliation point is real, but so also is the desire to dominate on the part of Putin, these other countries without regard. as a
Yeah.
secondary
I mean,
or
I
yeah,
think these
right,
things are tied together, though, for Russians, right? Like
right,
it is itself a national humiliation that all these territories that Putin and many other Russians consider part of the traditional Russian landmass are independent and have ideas of their own. That is itself a sort of humiliation. And again, people always accuse me of like hating Russians because I have strong views about, but I think it's an understandable. I mean, how would we feel if we lost the entire Western United States to Mexico? Like, it would
right.
be a type of humiliation from where we'd come before. So even though the Soviet Union was an evil empire and the Russian Federation today does evil things to Ukraine, to the Baltic states, et cetera, like you can sort of understand, at least theoretically, why they feel claim to these things and why they feel humiliated by it. But I just tend to think like, too bad, like you don't get to do that in response to your own humiliation. But the I guess the question I want to close on here is, you alluded to this earlier, but I want to bring it out more explicitly. Putin essentially in the last half of this interview really paints a picture of American decline, of global power of America, very very much in retreat. He makes these insinuations about going off the dollar. He compared America to the fading Roman Empire. These are all, I think, things that we are thinking of ourselves as well. I mean, I think Americans do have that malaise of feeling like we are in decline. We had this, failure to withdraw from Afghanistan, whatever one thinks about the withdrawal or not. But we covered on this program how completely botched something that should be relatively easy and simple for a country of the power and wealth of the United States to pull off. I mean, it seems like we are suffering on new humiliations daily. You know, what
Yeah,
is your view though of sort of the balance of power? Because as easy as it is to criticize the United States, I think people sometimes don't temper those criticisms with the weaknesses of our potential rivals, right? That they're not like on this trajectory to strength and we're on the trajectory down. So what do you think about those remarks that Putin made about American decline? And what's your assessment of the chance that he's right?
I think he's ultimately wrong, assuming, which is a big assumption, of course, that we can resolve our issues with the national debt, border security, for example, civil society, political structures being able to hold true. Because if you look at demographics, the United States is far stronger in a long-term demographic trajectory than either Russia or China, who both face potentially catastrophic demographic challenges. But I think more broadly, the political incentives for alignment with the United States, if the United States is willing to both push allies, which is really necessary in terms of Europe, but also attract them to a mutual beneficial high value goods trade and services economies, technology, etc. The weaknesses of the Chinese and Russian systems are inherent in that they are autocratic. They are the few benefit to the expense of the many. Capital investment. Look at China. Xi Jinping is essentially destroying China's economy because he thinks he can decide where the best investment should be made instead of the free market. Corruption is endemic in Russia, less so in China, but still significant there, which you see in the military. The basic political structures are frail and far less appealing, I think, than the American system. And especially that becomes relevant in terms of how other nations make their decisions about who to engage with in the longer term. And I think, as one sort of concluding point here, there's a reason the United States has a lot more friends than Russia does. And it's not about military power. It's really about people deciding over sustained governments of different left and right forms that ultimately it's better to be with the Americans than the Russians or the Chinese. And that is America's opportunity, again, grounded with, especially I think, that national debt point, resolving our own issues. The idea that America is in decline and China and Russia are in ascendancy is almost laughable, with the caveat that the Chinese military in a conventional sense at the moment could defeat the US military. So we better get real about that China military challenge.
Yeah, it's I feel like the decline is real, but people forget that it's often a race between midgets,
Right,
like
right,
as in even if America declines from our previous posture, that doesn't mean that the Russian and Chinese systems are, as you say, without their inherent flaws that make it difficult for them to project power. So I guess we'll find out. We, as the Chinese curse says, we live in interesting times. So
Yeah.
Tom, thank you, Tom Rogan, Washington Examiner. You can find his work there. Thanks, Tom, for coming on and really explaining a lot of these issues from the Putin interview.
It was a great discussion. I appreciate it, Inez.
Thanks so much. And thank you to our listeners. I have a little script to read that I'm always behind on. Thank you to our listeners. High Noon with Inez Stepman is a production of the Independent Women's Forum. As always, you can send comments and questions to Inez Stepman at iwf.org. Please help us out by hitting the subscribe button and leaving us a comment or review on Apple Podcasts, Acast, Google Play, YouTube, or iwf.org. Be brave, and we'll see you next time on High Noon.